at 2 p.m. from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel will help commemorate the museum's 10th anniversary. Next, Saturday's forum on perceptions of the U.S. abroad. That's followed by a study comparing prescription drug prices in the U.S. and 8 other countries. After that, World Bank President James Wolfensohn.
Welcome to 2003 Fall Fellows Conference on the Presidency. We are the Center for the Study of the Presidency, and we want a special welcome to the Fall Fellows here. Around 70 colleges are represented from the top universities and colleges, students from those colleges, as well as our C-SPAN audience. We welcome you as well. Today we have a panel looking at the battle of ideas in the 21st century. But first, let me offer a few remarks on our Center Fellows, who are the focus of our program here today in Washington, D.C. Each year, students come from top colleges to study the presidency, and we try to imbue in them a spirit of public service and leadership, as well as the academic excellence they bring to us. And we ask of them that they excel in the research and writing of a paper. And last year's students produced this volume of essays, and this year's class will do so as well. And we are also looking forward to their reports in the spring. They'll write their papers over the winter session. As a center, we look at the presidency and try to strengthen the executive decision-making process. We do so by consulting sometimes with agencies, sometimes with the White House officials, and sometimes with Congress. We also pursue individual initiatives that we think need sharpening focus, and one of those today is on the battle of ideas in U.S.-Muslim communications. The discussion will be introduced by Dr. Abshire, who is a NATO ambassador, our president of the Center for the Study of the Presidency, and a co-founder of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He also has served in the White House as special counsel to the president, and in 1974 was the first chairman of the Board for International Broadcasting. Dr. Abshire.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. As we have a lot of great speakers here, I really get around when I listen to you and your discussion of your papers, I realize that that's really the heart of this program, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next spring when the shoots that started now will have produced some great products. We've been talking about qualities that make up great presidents and qualities that make up great presidential war leaders. Communications, the ability to communicate in great leaders has always been fundamental. Great leaders want to change minds. Great leaders want to have influence. Caesar, through his orations and through his writings, knew that. Alexander the Great knew it. Our great presidents have known that the role of perceptions in the final analysis are what make the difference. The human factors, the ability to change minds, to move people to greater action. It was Theodore Roosevelt who wrote so many books on his own that first talked about the bully pulpit and worked in the beginning of the progressive movement to put forward ideas that really changed the country. Well, when we got into the Cold War, President Eisenhower, who had been a five-star general and was really a grand strategist, realized that the role of ideas and the minds of the world would be key to winning the Cold War. And he realized that you had to have more than simply presidential communications, personal communications, but that you had to have institutions to back it up. And he created the United States Information Agency, and he put into that agency George Allen, who was very close to him and had his ear. Jack Kennedy, a great communicator, realized the importance of USIA and of having a person like Ed Murrah, perhaps the top nationally known commentator of that period, to head it up, who had his ear. Lyndon Johnson, Leonard Marks, who had built the Johnson Communications empire and was close to him. Charlie Wick with Ronald Reagan. You know, it seems almost inconceivable that after this success, that in the late 1990s, people would conclude that this kind of effort was no longer important because of the end of the Cold War, and USIA was abolished, it was dismembered, it was put into the State Department as an economy effort, but also with the thought that every State Department officer should be in public diplomacy. And I think it's widely recognized now that that action by the Congress was an unfortunate mistake. In our resources, we have not put the funding into this area that is needed at a time that we have anti-Americanism that has grown enormously over the last few years around the world. And that anti-Americanism has grown to the point that it threatens our basing structure even. And we've seen this in Saudi Arabia, where we've had to draw down our troops. So we're not equipped, we're not organized, and we're not invested to win this battle of minds, this search for reaching other minds and creating better communications. Today our government is too compartmentalized. The Defense Department has the sole responsibility for the communications in Iraq, and the radios that have been put in there, the Iraqi media network. The Defense Department in other ways, with our presence around the world, is a key player. We have we will have a new undersecretary in the State Department. We have in the White House after 9/11 an office of coordination was set up for information, but it's really dealing with the tactical in the near term. Now, there have been 3 hard-hitting policy reports from different organizations on this subject. The first was the Council on Foreign Relations, where Pete Peterson, former Secretary of Commerce, head of the Blackstone Group, chairman of the council, personally led an effort and a report. The second is our own report, which fill us to hope, directed here, an initiative strengthening the U.S. Muslim communications. This was supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, by the Scholl Foundation, this overall effort, and by the McCormick Tribune Foundation. We brought together, Phyllis brought together a wide array of Muslim scholars so that we could get a better two-way street and a better understanding. And as this was being completed, Congressman Wolf, very powerful chairman of the Subcommittee of Appropriations that deals with the State Department, wrote into the authorization bill that there should be an official advisory group that looked into this subject. And former Ambassador Ed Derigian, who now directs the Baker Institute at Houston, Texas, was a very able chairman of this, and I had the pleasure of serving on it. If we're going to build the capabilities to change minds where we're losing minds around the world, we've got to do 2 things. There's got to be a huge jump in the financial resources. Napoleon said the moral is to the physical, the perceptions is to the armies and navies as 3:1. He was a pretty smart general until he went into Russia, into Waterloo. But that's a shocking statement. If you look at our investments, the investments that are put into the moral, the perceptions, are very small, and no wonder we're losing out around the world. This has got to be changed. Many of us are working actively with the administration and the Congress. And what was recommended in these two reports is a new strategic architecture at the White House level, where there's a special counselor to the president in the cabinet. I was a special counselor for a brief period of time in the cabinet. A special counselor who's got the president's ear. So often, the president can say things the wrong way inadvertently for a foreign audience, because so frequently he addresses a domestic audience in different terms. So we start with the commander-in-chief, the bully pulpit at the top, but then we must have this special counselor that can give advice to the better synergizing and reaching out to the creativity of the private sector, where we're the leader of the information revolution around the world, but we're a failure in our global communications. So we have proposed a board of experts under this special counselor, some of which are drawn from the private sector, some from our companies that communicate all over the world, like Coca-Cola or Procter & Gamble or AOL, and then some who may be experts on the Muslim world and others the non-Muslim worlds. Give them the power to audit and to build the synergies of all these government parts so that we really mobilize this talent in this endeavor. Now, what we're going to do this morning, I'm going to turn things over to Phyllis DeHope. One of the conclusions that emerged from our studies is that an asset that we have that we must project abroad are Muslim Americans, Muslims in the United States, the makeup of our great democracy. We're more diverse than any country in the world, and we've learned to handle our religious differences in civil ways. So we're delighted that we have Asma Hasan with us today, and with her book, copies in the back, and that is going to add greatly to our discussions. And we have another very fine scholar that Phyllis will introduce, who has the last paper in this publication. Phyllis DeHope has her bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Louvain, her master's in economics from George Washington at CSIS. She ran the Polish Action Commission that Spig Brzezinski directed. Now I'll call on Phyllis.
Well, as Dr. Abshire mentioned, we have two speakers that will approach our topic from slightly different perspectives. Our topic being turning around the image of America abroad. Lynn Kunkle, who I will introduce to you, but she'll be taking more of a foreign policy view on this, its relationship to it, how it has to change or not change. And Asma Hasan will present a Muslim American perspective with regard to this issue. Lynn is an adjunct professor at American University in the International Peace and Conflict Resolution Program. And her work there has primarily focused on the study of Christian-Muslim relations, with a particular emphasis on U.S. public diplomacy with Muslim societies. She received her master's degree from George Mason University, where she studied the role of religion in conflict genesis and revolution in the Abrahamic traditions. And she has had extensive experience living abroad, first as the daughter of a diplomat growing up in Africa, and later as an undergrad at the American University of Cairo, and most recently, just before she returned to study here in the United States, she taught English in Indonesia for 3 years. And Asma Hasan is the author given another plug, but of
American
American Muslims, the new generation. And as Dr. Abshire said, we have copies in the back, and Asma will be signing them after the session. But she's also written a number of fictional short stories, which were featured in, among others, the youth literary magazine Maryland's Pen. And one of her stories was published in a book called Taking Off, Coming of Age Stories, and was nominated by the ALA as a best book for young adults. She has been a columnist for the Denver Post and the Pakistan-linked newspapers, and among others, again, featured on USA Today, Fox News, CNN, Politically Incorrect, the New York Times, National Public Radio, and Voice of America. She is a graduate of New York University School of Law, where she was staff editor on the Review of Law and Social Change. So we'll start with Asma, if you could be so nice to come up. And we're delighted to have both of you here, I should have said.
Well, thank you for that great introduction, and thank you for having me. You know, I always enjoy speaking, but especially I enjoy speaking to students because I like to think of myself as a student. It wasn't so long ago that I was in the position that a lot of you are in, studying and learning, and I wrote a thesis that is sort of similar to the papers that you're writing now, and eventually after I graduated, I was able to take that thesis and turn it into this book. So I hope that, you know, all of you are able to have that similar experience, and I look forward to hearing you speak someday and being where you are right now. Anyway, since my book is about Islam in America, I thought that I would start by talking a little bit about who American Muslims are. There's about 7 to 8 million Muslims in the United States. That's a conservative estimate. There could be as many as 20 million. We don't really know because on the census we don't ask religion, you know, what your religion is. This is based on immigration statistics, mosque attendance, and a couple other factors. So out of this, you know, population of about, 8 million, the estimate, how many do you think are Arab? Probably you think a lot of them are Arab. Actually, only about 12 to 20% of that 7 to 8 million are Arab background. And this is really surprising for people to hear. I was just telling someone earlier today that when I go to speak at various events, people will say, oh, it's so nice to finally have an Arab speaker. We've never had one before. And I'll say, well, actually, you still don't. I'm not Arab. But because I'm Muslim, people assume, oh, that I must be Arab. Actually, in the Islamic world, the Arab population is a minority. The majority of the American Muslim population, about half, is South Asian descent, like me. People whose parents came from, Pakistan, like mine did, and other South Asian and Asian countries. That's most of the American Muslim population. A little less than half of the American Muslim population is African American. So that's, if you think about that, almost half of the American Muslims are not even immigrant background. They're people who have been here, whose families have been here for generations. The final 1%, the small 1%, which seems like a small amount, but 1% of 7 to 8 million is actually a lot. So about 1% of the American Muslim population are converts from what we don't traditionally think of as being Muslim. They're white converts, Latino Americans who have converted, and Native Americans who have converted. The immigrant portion, they come from all over the world, from Pakistan, India, from the Arab world, as we've been talking about, from Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Russia. There's Muslims from all over the world. And when the ambassador was talking about how America is the most diverse country in the world, American Muslims are the most diverse group of Muslims in the world. When we come from all over the world, we bring with us or we actually leave behind some of the culture that's in those Islamic countries. Some of it we keep, but some of it we leave behind because those traditions are harder to maintain. And this is actually a good thing for Islam because a lot of those cultural practices have nothing to do with Islam. They are not in the Quran. They're not anything that's sanctioned by Islam, but because they were practiced before Islam existed, they got wrapped up in the practice of Islam. So I hate to bring this up because it's such a sort of uncomfortable topic, but we hear a lot about female genital mutilation and that Muslims practice this and that it's a Muslim practice. There's nothing in the Quran that says do female genital mutilation. In fact, if anything, there's arguments to the contrary, not to hurt people and especially women. Women should be treated with respect. There's nothing in the Quran saying do female genital mutilation. However, because female genital mutilation existed before Islam, when Islam came to the countries that practiced it, and to those people, they didn't abandon it. They kept doing it, and it's been going on for years, and now it's sort of hard to separate those things out. So as an American Muslim, for me, for other American Muslims, by leaving Islamic countries, we got to leave a lot of those things behind, and we get to focus on the Quran. When I go to a mosque, let's say if I walk into a mosque here in the Washington, D.C. area, there's going to be Muslims of Egyptian background, of other Arab backgrounds, other South Asian Muslims, Muslims who are converts that were born here. There's going to be a whole variety of ethnicities. So the only thing we can agree on, because we can't agree on our culture, is we can only agree on the Quran, and we focus on the Quran. And this is a positive development for Islam, because what's happening in Islamic countries is this culture just keeps drawing Muslims away from what the Quran really truly says. In fact, in America right now, the young female Muslim population, the Muslim women in my generation, are very educated, very intelligent, and I think in the next 20 years we're going to see great achievements being made by American Muslim women who right now are in their 20s and 30s, so be on the lookout for that. Some of you may be in that group. So when we talk about outreach to the Islamic world, how do we improve our image? How do we look better to the Islamic world? The greatest resource is sitting right here in the United States. It's American Muslims. It's people like me. It's other people who have immigrated. It's the children of immigrants. It's African American Muslims and other converts. They are the strongest resource for us. There is no stronger image, no stronger message that we can send to the Islamic world than here are other Muslims who are enjoying living in America, who are happy, who have great jobs, great lives, and they still maintain their Islam. They're very religious. We should really utilize American Muslims. We should send them to Islamic countries to talk about Islam in America and to talk about how happy they are here. We should make documentaries about them and have them air in Arab and Islamic media. We should also ask Arab and Islamic media, present to their writers, why don't you write a story about this American Muslim who is the CEO of a large American company. All that would be very powerful for Muslims in Islamic countries. To the extent possible also, I think that where we can appoint ambassadors or other diplomats who are Muslim to go to Islamic countries, we should try to do that. It would be so powerful if the ambassador to, let's say, Indonesia calls up the Indonesian prime minister or another official and says, let's go to the mosque and pray together. Me as an American Muslim, you as an Indonesian Muslim. That would be so powerful. It would be such a strong message, and it would go so far, and it would just be a very simple thing. This is something that I think the outreach has to be sponsored by the U.S. government, because if I go to Pakistan on my own to talk about, my book or just generally, people won't respect it as much. They won't see the U.S. as getting behind it. They'll just think that it was my own, little trip that I did. So really, the government needs to get behind this, and it's a simple thing to do. American Muslims really want to go and talk about Islam in America. It's very frustrating for me when I see, Muslims in the street in Islamic countries protesting against America. It's frustrating for me because they don't have the right idea about America. To some degree, maybe some of the criticism is deserved, but Islam is not a bad place for America. Islam can do very well in America. So, American Muslims, we love America. We'd love to have the opportunity to promote America abroad. When I was told to prepare my remarks for this, one of the things that Phyllis said to me is, imagine that this is your 15 minutes with the president. So you all are my President Bush. So here's my pitch to you. President Bush, if you could just, every few months, arrange to take a picture with an American Muslim, somewhere here in America, doing something, just, a photo, nothing too fancy, and then release it to the media, especially Islamic media in Islamic countries. that would be very valuable. It would do more than millions of dollars of advertising. And the reason it would be powerful is because Muslims would see it and say, you know, President Bush really respects Muslims and respects Islam. Look, there he's shaking their hands. There he is, you know, eating with them. Or there he is, you know, looking at a Quran that has just been presented to him by a Muslim. You know, that would be so important. And I'll give you an example. After 9/11, President Bush went to visit a mosque here in the Washington, D.C. area. And it was the first time that an American president had visited a mosque since Eisenhower. I don't even know when Eisenhower was president. I don't even know what year that was. That's how long ago. And there's over 1 billion Muslims in the world, and yet an American president had not been to a mosque in that long. That's really too bad. But when he did go, it was very exciting. When I was coming home from running an errand, and I turned the TV on, and there was it looked like a mosque, and President Bush was in there, and my heart just sort of skipped a beat. I was like, is he in a mosque? And then, you know, the ticker on the bottom said President Bush visits mosque, you know, in DC area. And I was so excited, and I was so touched. And then later on, you know, and the comments that he made were just so incredible. And he said, Muslims are Americans too. We should treat them with respect. And I just couldn't believe it. I was out of breath. I was excited, and I wanted to email all my friends and tell them, you know, Bush was at a mosque. And it seems like, you know, it wasn't that hard for him to do, you know, and probably to all of you, it's like, oh yeah, you know, big deal, he was at a mosque. But for a Muslim, it's so exciting. It shows that he has respect, that he cares. And, you know, in order to go into that mosque and go through the prayer area, President Bush had to take his shoes off in his Secret Service. And they did, because the prayer area for Muslims is considered sacred and supposed to stay clean, so everyone's instructed to take their shoes off. And just the fact that he took his shoes off and did that, and his Secret Service did too, is so moving to me. It touches me so much. And it really, it made me so excited, and it really does help Muslims abroad to see that. It really helps how our image is, and it wasn't a hard thing to do. You know, Muslims, we're just like anybody else. You know, we have pride. We want to feel important, and when, you know, President Bush goes to a mosque, that makes us feel important, makes us feel good about ourselves, makes us feel more secure, and then it makes it easier for us to have dialogue and to reach out and to say, okay, you know, we disagree with what U.S. did, you know, here, or we disagree with this policy, but we respect you, and we know that you respect us. In that vein, President Bush, since we're talking here, you know, open, woman to people, if you could also visit, President Bush, if you could visit an Islamic country once a year, or maybe, you know, twice a year, and do some things with locals, maybe have some pictures of you eating local food or doing a local custom, visiting a local mosque, that would be really great. Just recently, President Bush, you visited Bali, and you were there for only 3 hours, but the 3 hours you were there were very effective. President Bush met with local leaders in Indonesia, and it was a very civil meeting, and the Muslims were polite, but they were firm and said, you know, we have this impression that all Americans think Muslims are terrorists. And President Bush was like, well, you know, I don't think that, and, you know, and they had a nice exchange, and that picture is going all over the Islamic world. That one picture, and that is very valuable, and it's going to help the image of the U.S. abroad. And it didn't really cost us that much money. You know, President Bush was on his way to another meeting and he stopped. So I think there should be more of that, and more than just 3 hours, but actually spending some time and engaging, you know, showing pictures of President Bush engaging with people. I'm going to give you an example of where, you know, President Bush or someone from his administration could have visited, and it might have been more helpful. Right after 9/11, the U.S. begged Pakistan for its help. You know, we saw Colin Powell on TV saying it would be really crucial to have Pakistan's help in this, you know, in this war on terror. And, you know, I remember seeing that just constantly. That was the message. And Pakistan was starting to agree, starting to become interested. And then around that time, when Pakistan was starting to say, yes, we think we'll do this, the U.S. asked Tony Blair to go visit Pakistan and to talk to Pakistan about the war on terror and how important it was that Pakistan help. So Tony Blair came, and Tony Blair's great. You know, he's a terrific person. Never met him, but I'm sure, you know, he's very good at his job. But the Pakistanis were like, you know, this is a little insulting. We're giving the U.S. access to Afghanistan, to the Taliban, to Osama bin Laden potentially, we're giving our blessings to whatever the action the U.S. is going to take, and yet Bush didn't even come here to talk to us about it. I got an email from a relative of mine around the same time who said, how do you get repaid for helping the U.S.? They send Tony Blair to lecture you. And that's not, how we want people to perceive us. Maybe Bush didn't have to go, but I think Colin Powell or, another person from the U.S. administration, Pakistanis would have really liked that. They would have really appreciated that. And Pakistan wants to do the right thing, and that was the right thing to do to help the U.S. and continue to help the U.S., but we should reward that. When there's an Islamic country who is helping us out, we should reward that and say, we're going to send our best people to meet with your best people because we like having a partnership with you. When I was in Pakistan in the winter of 1997, I was at a family friend's house, and she said to me, I was just watching television, and the African Americans are going to make their own country. And I was like, really? And she was like, oh yeah, it was on CNN. They have their own language too, Ebonics. And they're going to make their own country. They even have a name picked out. And I was like, listen, I was just there, and I live there, and I think that you're misunderstanding. She was like, no, it was on CNN. That's absolutely true. They're making their own country. When you go back, they'll have their own passports. It'd be totally different. And I was like, well, I don't think that's right. And she just insisted. So I finally just gave up. One of the things that we have to realize in Islamic countries, there's no free press. The press is run by the state. So when there's a story in the news, it's accepted as fact. Because there's not this idea that free press is an opinion. So they don't realize when they watch news from America that this isn't a perspective on the news. This is not exactly what's happening. And as a result, right now, they think that all American Muslims are suffering and that they're under pressure. And certainly, there are some Muslims who have suffered from discrimination and some Muslims who have been imprisoned, but definitely it's been a very small minority. So we have to realize when our media does stories to make sure to present the other side or at least have some counterbalancing views in other media outlets. There's definitely a lot of work to do. This past June, my mother and brother visited Pakistan. They said everywhere they went, when people heard their accent and realized they were American, they would stop them and say, America's got a lot of problems, and let me just tell you everything. And everywhere they went, people were complaining, and they couldn't even walk like 1 foot without someone complaining to America about them. So there's definitely a lot of work to do. But there's a couple simple things we can do that I talked about, like sending President Bush to Islamic countries to visit more, having people like me, American Muslims, go and promote the cause of Islam and America in Islamic countries. Just those couple simple things would really help things and make things better. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to meeting all of you and hearing your questions at the end of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Lynn Kunkle will now tell us a little bit about her thoughts with regard to U.S. foreign policy.
Very much. Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much. It's very much of an honor to be speaking with such a distinguished group of young men and women who represent the future of American leadership. And I think it's a wonderful program to bring you here to reflect on and consider what leadership is and what leadership means in this country, and particularly at this point in time looking at the role of our image and how image is tied very closely to our leadership. I would invite you to consider how, in this country, we tend to think of the American president in terms of being a political party leader, in terms of an administration leader, in terms of a national leader, but we tend to under-theorize and look less at the American president in terms of a global leader. And when we do think of a global leadership, we tend to think in terms of military dominance or economic dominance, but we tend to not consider actually the source of American global leadership abroad, which has traditionally been our moral authority. The capacity to inspire and give hope to people that we have had across the world has not been the successful PR coup. It has actually been very much grounded on principles. It has been the demonstrated willingness to accept costs to the benefit of other people. All over the Middle East, actually, Wilson's points of light are often talked about as signaling a transformation in what they thought was a universal West that tended to exploit, that tended to interfere in their politics, using moral rhetoric to cover what is essentially naked ambition and naked greed. And when they heard Wilson's points of light, it was a shocking break for them to see a Western Christian country stand up and use a moral argument that restrained their own power with no apparent benefit to the United States. The United States didn't benefit militarily or economically. And it impressed not just the Middle East, but the rest of the world that had been colonized up to that point. And it's not just Wilson that impressed the Middle East. I remember there is probably no other culture in the world that enjoys more sitting around having hot tea and political conversation than what you'll find in Arab campuses in the Middle East. And I would be told so many times how Eisenhower stood up to the British and the French and the Israelis in the Suez Crisis, and apparently to cost to himself, a potential cost to himself, in speaking up against his allies, and again with no apparent benefit to him, but merely on the principle of the matter, that the Suez Canal belonged to the Egyptians and they should retain their sovereignty over it. And this won the United States a tremendous amount of goodwill and a tremendous amount of respect, because it was unprecedented, and the United States distinguished itself from politics as usual, the way things had traditionally been done. And they would tell me over and over again as well, America had never colonized. This was a different country. It set itself in that sense apart from Europe, not just in the Middle East, but also in the world. The situation, I went back 9 years ago, 9 years later, after I had been an undergraduate there, is dramatically different, dramatically different. The goodwill that we had is not just gone, it's worse than that, in the sense that they feel like they have been had. They feel like they have bought into a lie. That in fact, no, indeed, it was all about greed, or they feel like they were suckers, which makes the job of improving our image that much more difficult, because we're not just trying to improve our image, we're struggling to get it back to zero, in a sense. But when I had Arab and Muslim students passionately arguing with me 9 years before that America represented their best and only hope for democracy, that it was only the United States that could restrain their own governments or help to balance their power not only against their own governments but with Israel, that to see 9 years later that there wouldn't be a single Arab student on any campus anywhere that would publicly or privately defend the United States, so much has happened in 9 years that we really do need to take a look at. And I think much of this has to do with the transformation that we're trying to have between national leadership and being a global leader. Because again, so much of what the presidency is about is pandering, in a sense, to a domestic audience, to the people who elected him, and speaking to domestic audiences as well. But we keep forgetting in the process that we also have global responsibilities, that we have inspired other nations and we have inspired other people who believed that we represented principles, that we spoke for the powerless, that in fact has been demonstrated in the last 9 years to them, to Arabs and Muslims at least, that that was not the case. In that short period of time, I remember I left right when the Eastern European countries were democratizing, and they thought, well, their turn was coming up next, that the wave of democracy was soon going to be washing over them, that Cold War is now over, there's no reason to be supporting these regimes, these anti-communist regimes. That turned out not to be the case. The wave came and left, and not a thing had changed in the Middle East. Still today, there's an expression in the Middle East, if you speak out politically, you go to jail or hell. Because if you go to jail, you get the tar beaten out of you, and if you wind up being killed, you're going to hell, because you have religious leaders that say if you go against the state, well, you're going against Islam. And this is a situation that Western Christians also experienced, and it took them roughly 1,000 years to get the courage to disbelieve that as well. So you have religious leaders in the pocket of the state and so on. So nothing has changed in terms of that. They've seen the rest of the world develop and integrate economically, and standards of living improved that did not touch the Middle East at all. When they warmly sort of supported the first President Bush in the Gulf War because on the grounds of Saddam Hussein, what he had done was wrong. What they wound up having was not a change in democracy, but bases in Saudi Arabia and all these things, and the collapse of the Oslo Accords, which to them had represented a hopeful ending of a period of conflict with American support, collapsed. So what they wound up having in the course of 9 years is believing that absolutely nobody cared. Nobody was interested, nobody was listening, and America would be more content if they would just be quiet and continue to eke out whatever existence they may be having. And this was profoundly crestfalling to the Arab and the Muslim world. So again, this has much to do with what are we going to do in terms of our national responsibilities versus our global responsibilities. These are in direct tension with one another, and in many ways we're having growing pains trying to figure out how do we communicate to the world that we do care, if we do care. And if we do care, we have to find ways to demonstrate this very tangibly. If we rely solely on politics as usual, and well, our president's only accountable to us, politics as usual in this sense is a betrayal of our global responsibilities and what we've promised the world and what we've represented to the world. We have to figure out ways to communicate to the rest of the world that they do indeed matter. Let them eat cake is not appropriate or dignified for a great power. It is not acceptable to think that we don't actually need other people. What we need we can buy, or what we need we can force, ultimately. It's an abdication of moral responsibility. Ultimately, if we want to change our image, we do have to consider more deeply our role, either in terms of our national responsibility and our global ones, that we have to demonstrate we are interested in the welfare and the concerns of other nations. We have to recognize in doing so the contributions that other civilizations have, what they have to contribute to the world culturally, what they have to say about their own hopes and dreams, we have to be able to listen to. How can we help them if we do not know them? We have to get to know them, and particularly with Islam and Muslim countries. There is a very deep, deep prejudice which exists in predominantly Christian cultures against Islam, and it goes way back. It's a very long history that for some reason has a difficult time recognizing the moral equality of Islam as a great religion, and that has to be addressed. It has to be brought into dialogue, because if we're looking to have a democracy flourish, democracy is participation. We can't insist on a form. We have to allow the people who are participating to, in dialogue, figure out what form of democracy suits them best and suits their own needs and dreams and goals. And in so doing, what we can do here in terms of reaching out over there is to support very much what Asma was saying, in the sense that we need to have Arab and Muslim Americans in positions of power, in decision-making, in visible public decision-making power. So we can use, in a sense, we can demonstrate that we are overcoming, in a sense, prejudices, that we are interested in what Arab and Muslim Americans, we can use their understanding of cultures to build relationships. And we can also deal with the perception that exists in the Middle East right now that our foreign policy is uniformly, monolithically pro-Israel. And pro-Israel means, of course, in the Middle East, almost by definition anti-Arab, that there is nothing in that policy that demonstrates concern for the well-being and for the integrity and the dignity of Arab culture or Arab history. And in a sense, providing Arab and Muslims with positions of prominence is an extremely positive step towards building a relationship and demonstrating that we are interested in helping them in understanding what they're about. So again, this has to do with engaging Islam as well and Islamic leaders publicly through dialogues and through conferences, and in acknowledging the strengths and the contributions of Arab and Islamic cultures and civilization. We also do need to be strong enough to acknowledge their grievances, and there are significant grievances that these cultures also have with the West and also with the United States. I will hurry this up here, but in addition also too, I understand that we are it's important that we do have to provide security, and it is important to do these things in Iraq. However, the dignity of the individual should be of paramount concern. Cultural sensitivity is extremely important, but also demonstrating at all times the dignity that we accord these people as guests in their country. And ultimately, that is what we are. This is different than occupation in Japan and Germany, where it was a population that had gone to war against the United States. These are not a people who had gone to war against the United States, as Bush has mentioned. So in a sense, what I'm urging us to do is to learn and to listen and to care and to do this sincerely. We have traditionally been a culture that's been very self-absorbed, and we've been forgiven for that sort of weaknesses because we've always been a very principled country, and we were fascinating in our own way anyway. But to be self-absorbed and unprincipled makes us very dangerous. And so it is, I would, in invoking Eisenhower again, there's a very famous quote that I think was important for all of you who are going to be the ones that are going to be integrating our values and principles in American leadership, and who will be struggling to reconcile our national leadership identity with the global one. To remember that Eisenhower had said that America is great because America is good. And when America ceases to be good, it will cease to be great. And there's a lot more than just Americans that are invested in this country being great. So I look forward to how you will integrate this in the coming years, and I look forward to hearing more from you in our discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very thoughtful. And we'll take questions now. And I think you all know the drill after a couple of days. If you would, do we have a center mic, or are we going to be passing the mic? Raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you. If you could introduce yourself and let us know which school you are representing. Okay, please.
My name is Jonathan Kaiser from the United States Air Force Academy. And Dr. Kunkle, you mentioned that given current relations with Israel, where the United States is seen as anti-Arab. Now, in light of another comments too by Dr. Hasan, do you think that it's possible for us to improve relations with the Arab world without modifying or changing our stance right now with Israel?
That would be an ideal course of action if that's possible to do. Increasingly, especially since September 11th, our foreign policies have become virtually synonymous, even in terms of the language that we use, the metaphors we use. They're virtually indistinguishable. And that is, the problem with that is that if we wind up having Israel set the course and the tone of American foreign policy, then of course there are some very real concerns that Arabs and Muslims have about that. So if there are ways that if we can think in terms of promoting a security for Israel that has to do with promoting the security and well-being of Arabs, that is ideally the way to go. If we can push our focus away from strictly looking in terms of military security, but to look at human security in the sense that Israel would be safer with a prosperous and a democratic and a healthy, functioning Arab society. And I think that the United States is in a position to be able to push for that kind of a look, that both of these, they both benefit from being good neighbors, and we can help ensure that both of them are good neighbors.
I think this question is very important. I know Dr. Abshire wanted to make a comment about it, but also I'd like to direct the question to you afterwards, Asma. So.
Well, you know, I think it's important on Israel as it's important on the United States to distinguish between leaders at a given time and the country. I knew Prime Minister Begin. He started out as a terrorist. He became a great peacemaker. He worked with Sadat, took the initiative on Sadat coming to Israel. I remember visiting Israel not long after that, and visiting with the defense minister, Ezra Weitzman, who said, you know, if I could get good maps and good wine on the Champs-Élysées with the military, I could work out security. And I think that recently we've had the Israeli chief of staff, as well as others in the military, question the policies of attrition that are being carried out. And so Israeli democracy, Israeli prosperity is being hurt, and Arab prosperity is being hurt. We've been very involved with the Seeds of Peace group. You know, it is possible to come together with a win-win for all concerned. And I think that's what we need. And that's what we've got to achieve. And of course, this takes U.S. leadership.
Asma?
Yes, I'll just quickly respond. First of all, the young man who asked the question, congratulations on being at the Air Force Academy. I know it wasn't easy to get to the Air Force Academy, but and I'm always impressed with those who are in military service. My suggestions that I made in my talk will definitely go a far way, and I know Dr. Kunkle said that we're below zero right now. My suggestions will help us to get to zero and more than that. You know, in the end, we probably will have to address our policies to, you know, get back to where we were, as Dr. Kunkle was saying. But mine will help, you know, in starting that process and more, setting us on that course very well. For Israel's long-term security and for us as allies of Israel and friends of Israel, we need to think of this too. All the Arab countries around Israel, over half the population is under the age of 20. And we watch reality TV, they watch the ultimate reality TV. They watch Al Jazeera every day, almost 24 hours a day. They're growing up basically hating Israel. And this is wrong. Israel exists for a reason. Islamic countries should recognize Israel and recognize that Israel is our friend. But for Israel's long-term security, we as Americans need to say it's important that we get this resolved, because it's going to be, if it's difficult for Israel to exist now, once those 20-year-olds grow up, it's going to continue to be harder. So not only for our image abroad, but for Israel, we need to resolve this problem.
Lynn wanted to make another comment.
I just also wanted to say, too, what I think is key on this, especially with Al Jazeera and the images that they're seeing daily, the key point that is a constant source of frustration, it's the humiliation. It's the perceived humiliation. And that anytime you wind up encouraging anything that has to do with the dignity of individuals, even if you politically disagree, but the point is that their dignity is respected and observed, you're working automatically, sort of instantly, towards a long-term security and long-term peace. And this is the whole key difference between the short-term focus and a long-term.
And I'll just add that very briefly that our scholars, I think every single one of them, felt that this was the most central issue, and that if this isn't addressed, then we can engage in any type of activity with regard to public diplomacy, and it won't be effective. So next question.
Can I add just one quick thing? The last time I visited Pakistan was the winter of 2000, and if you had asked anybody what they thought about the Middle East, they'd be like, oh yeah, it's a conflict and whatever, and they didn't really have any strong opinions. Now if you visit, everybody has a strong opinion and feels very strongly that the U.S. is not doing right by the Palestinians. And it's been such a change that people who really didn't care, now it's their #1 issue, even more so than their own political issues.
That's a good point. Next question in the front row. Oh, okay. Third row.
I'm Justin Cox from Washington University in St. Louis. I was wondering what the panelists thought about how the policy shifts in the wake of 9/11 regarding the treatment of non-citizens within the United States has affected relationships with Arab and Muslim populations both in and outside of the United States.
Well, I do think it adds to an arsenal of complaints that have been developing. It's sort of another proof of the idea of hypocrisy, of mixed messages, that we are for rights, but except when we have a different agenda, when we have different issues. The whole issue of mixed messages and hypocrisy is one that we had gone so far in standing up for principles before, and ever since in the last decade, we've really slid back in that sense. And I think it just adds to a growing list of complaints that America has become increasingly inconsistent morally, part of an abdication of their moral authority.
Asma Hassan?
Well, I think this, whether the non-citizens that were arrested after 9/11, whether they are guilty or not, that I don't know. But I can say it was officially a PR disaster for America abroad, because a number of those non-citizens did eventually get deported. Some are still being held, but when they got deported and when they got back to whatever country they were from, the media there immediately did a story on them. In Pakistan, the equivalent to the New York Times, a newspaper there, it's called Dawn newspaper. They have done several front page stories on how these detainees were treated, how these non-citizens were treated. Some of them were forced to eat pork, they reported. And that's, when a Muslim hears that, that's a really bad thing. There's really nothing that you can say that it would be very hard to remedy that, and we can do it, but people are just stunned by that. So, however, whether they're, guilty or not, that I don't know. But at least when we do hold them, we should treat them nicely with respect, so that when they do go back to the country, that the media there isn't able to exploit it and sort of ride the wave of anti-Americanism to sell papers and to, get people to watch their TV channels and just sort of continue this anti-American theme.
Thank you. And now, in the first row, right here.
It's Mike Simmons, I attend Amherst College in Massachusetts. Dr. Klein, as you spoke, in the vein of improving U.S.-Islam relations, I thought heavily on what you said about, I thought heavily about, I thought about what you said about the equation that you set up about Islam promoting America abroad and the converse. And I think that it's definitely been the case that Pakistan obviously is key in our war, and as you told us, Islam citizens in America and abroad are definitely willing to make positive normative judgments about American principles. But my question is, what do you think America can do, and not just American citizens in general, but maybe the media, the American president, what can we do beyond culture, legitimization? What can we do beyond just shaking hands and having the president, just visit the mosque every now and then? I mean, what might be done insofar as policy or just something more substantive to promote Islam abroad and in America?
Well, I definitely like Dr. Kunkle's suggestions about we need to put more Arabs and Muslims in positions of power, because, you are right. The symbolic gestures, the things that I was talking about, are mainly symbolic, but they are really important. They do go a long way. And we're not really in a position yet to say, okay, we're going to appoint a Muslim Secretary of State. We can't just sort of do that tomorrow. So that'll take time to get Muslims and Arabs in positions of power. So the symbolic aspects are very important. But then once we've reached a certain stage, and we should start working on this right now, how do we tap into the resources of American Muslims, as Dr. Kunkle was suggesting, to put them in places where they can influence policy and where they can represent America abroad in a substantive way? There's a U.S. attorney in California who's Muslim, and the Muslim community is so excited about him and promotes him constantly and talks about him, because he's the only Muslim government official that any of us know of that's in this high position. And he's not even the U.S. attorney; he's an assistant U.S. attorney. But it's just so such a prominent position that for Muslims in America, it's like, wow, here's America, honoring and respecting the achievements of one of us. Imagine how far that would go in the Islamic world, to say that not only do we respect you, but the people in our own country who are Muslim, we have not embarrassed and we're not holding back on promoting them. We are a merit-based system, and we will reward those people who work hard and do well. And you definitely must be one of them, being at Amherst College, I would imagine. So congratulations.
Lynn, do you have a...
I do. I just wanted to mention something. In terms of cultural legitimation, it should not be underestimated in this culture. And I'll just give you a quick example. In 1991, Prince Charles was addressing an architectural society in London. and had made an offhand comment to the society that Islam had beautiful architecture and that there's a lot that the British architects could learn from Islamic architecture. And this was like the shot heard round the Middle Eastern world. Everybody heard, he was the toast of coffee shops all over Cairo. What a hero, he saw that there's something that Islam has to offer. And there are still websites you can find now, 10 years later, with full text speech and how marvelous this was. But the opportunities, the welcoming and the goodwill that comes from even legitimating the contributions and the value and the presence of what other people have in this world goes a far way to acknowledging that the United States is a leader that can be trusted, is somebody. Do you see what I mean? The legitimation is actually, it goes a long way towards the moral authenticity of America's position as well. It's not just simply symbolic getting to know you.
I'll mention just briefly, so we can take one more question, that our report gives one suggestion. This is also in the Council on Foreign Relations report, so it's been talked about for a while. But that would be finding some sort of means for the private sector to be able to participate in a type of public diplomacy initiative through films, like what you were talking about earlier, but also in the United States, educating students here in schools. And the Corporation for Public Diplomacy, which would be modeled after the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, is one idea of such an organization that could do that, funneling in both financial resources of the private sector as well as talent. And so that's another private sector type initiative that could be taken on. So we have time for one last question. So, okay, right here. Yeah. Yeah, I chose the person the furthest away from the mic. So that was on purpose. Okay.
We often hear stories that other nations don't dislike America so much as they dislike President Bush. So do you think, therefore, that a change in presidential leadership in 2004 would significantly help America's image abroad? I'm Amanda Turkle from Colgate University.
That's right, yeah.
Wow.
I think no. I think that the moment somebody else is there, the complaints will be the same. I think that that's, if any Muslim who says that is just sort of stalling and trying to hurl any kind of complaint they can. So I think no.
I might be more optimistic in the sense that I think if we did have a new administration, I think that there'll be open ears to hear if there's going to be any kind of shift, especially if somebody makes a comment that is considered beyond Islam as a religion of peace, which has become, politicized in all kinds of ways. If there is some gesture, I think that there are opportunities that could be in there that could help.
Well, I want to thank you both very much, Asma Hasan, and once again, her book is in the back, and Lynn Kunkle, really very insightful, very interesting, well expressed. And I think Dr. Abshire has a final
I want to
word.
end on a note of hope, because I think this administration and this Congress takes this issue as seriously as you do in this room. And this Changing Minds, Winning Peace, the Dirigion panel, when we met with the Deputy Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and others, they said, shake us up. We've got to get at this. And I had a meeting with Congressman Wolf, and we've had meetings with others on the Hill, Republicans and Democrats. I think this is taken very seriously. We've got a group on the outside that's going to stay with it. We think if we get this presidential advisor in there, if we get this Corporation for Public Diplomacy so that we communicate the best rather than the worst of our culture around the world, if we build a new breed of Foreign Service officers who speak the language, as we think anew on such things as American corners, if we think anew on the use of internet There are ways that this can be turned around. There must be the determination to do it, but the bad news is the good news. This is so serious that I think we're going to get action.
Oh, that makes me want to applaud. Thanks. I think we'll have a break now.
Those of you that need a refreshment, go get your refreshment. Please desist from talking because we're on the air. We must move forward and use every minute. So if you give me your attention and not make noise. It's my great pleasure to introduce one of our outstanding mentors. This program is really made through the mentorship, beginning in the autumn and then going through to the final production of the papers. And Paul Neely is a strong personal friend from my hometown of Chattanooga. He lives in a beautiful house on the side of a mountain and doesn't need to spend time in public service, and he is devoting his life to different areas of public service in the Chattanooga area and nationally, and leading the capital development campaign at Williams College, his alma mater. He has a distinguished career in journalism with the Courier-Journal in Louisville, St. Petersburg Times, and he ended up the publisher of the Chattanooga Times. We're very proud of the Chattanooga Times because it's the mother paper. Adolph Ox came from Chattanooga, the Chattanooga Times, and he bought the New York Times, and we regretted that that was sold and merged a few years ago. But it's a great New York Times. The Ox family is something that means, Sulzberger family means a lot to Chattanooga. Paul, thank you very much for your leadership here and for being with us and your panel today.
Thank you, David Abshire. It makes sense that I would moderate this panel. As a former newspaper reporter and editor, I'm quite used to pretending that articles are fair because there's a 50-50 symmetry of who's quoted in them. The nice thing about 50-50 symmetry is you don't have to make any intelligent judgment about who's right or wrong. You can just pretend you've been fair by being exactly equal. Today we have equal and parallel speakers with us. They are strikingly parallel. Les Campbell, to my immediate left, is the director of the National Democratic Institute's programs in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, what's the National Democratic Institute? Likewise, what's the International Republican Institute that Owen Kirby represents? They are both part of the National Endowment for Democracy. They are affiliated with the two respective political parties. They receive funds from Congress for the purpose of developing democratic institutions abroad. In a glib reductionism that's described as the political party's Peace Corps. Les is the director of the National Democratic Institute's programs in the Middle East and North Africa. Owen is the regional program director of the Middle East and North Africa. They are on parallel tracks, as you can tell. Owen, before his current position, headed NDI's field offices in Zagreb and Sarajevo. Before that, he had done work in Russia, Albania, Algeria, Georgia, and Yemen. Not the Georgia near Chattanooga, I might add. Before that, he was heavily involved in domestic politics in Canada and is in fact Canadian, oddly enough. Owen Kirby had worked previously as a program officer in Morocco, Oman, and West Bank, Gaza, as well as Jordan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. We're going to have a little different format here. Les is going to begin with a brief description about their program overall, including what his side of things does, and then if Owen would like to add to that either in a general sense or in what his side of his program does, he will do that. Then we'll run this more like a discussion. There are a number of places they have been. They do sometimes similar things, sometimes different things in those locales, and they will compare and contrast as you're used to seeing on test papers. Explaining both what they're doing out there in the field and why they do those things. David Abshire ended his last remarks talking about the charge to get at this. These are two people who are already at this. We'll begin with Les Campbell with his rather general description to start.
Thank you to Mr. Neely and to Rob Henderson and others at the Center for inviting us here. It's a privilege, and we both appreciate that. As the moderator mentioned, Owen and I have decided to do this a little differently than the previous presentations without having one of us go to the podium, because as strange as it may seem, as representatives of the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute, Owen and I actually see each other and talk to each other a lot. I think maybe sometimes too much. We'll see each other for 4 or 5 hours on Monday, and a week seldom goes by where we're not on the phone 2 or 3 times a week. So we very much work together, and we decided it might be more comfortable to go back and forth to talk a little bit about what we do, some of the similarities and some of the differences in more of a conversation format, since that's much more what we're used to in our work relationship. But before we did that, it's been my experience that very few people know that there are institutes attached to the political parties which work abroad and work internationally, and very few people know what these institutes might be doing, and even fewer people know that the party institutes work abroad in the Middle East. In fact, when I describe myself as NDI's Director of Middle East Programs, that usually gets at least one raised eyebrow, if not 2, because the notion that there are American organizations with a political tie doing a lot of work in the Middle East often strikes people as odd and maybe not probable. So I wanted to give you a little bit of history on the organizations and background so that you understood why they were formed and what they do. Both organizations are celebrating their 20th anniversary now. They were formed 20 years ago, 1983, as part and under the umbrella of the National Endowment for Democracy, which receives a congressional funding, as Mr. Neely mentioned, core funding each year. And the National Endowment for Democracy has under its umbrella what we call 4 core institutes. 2 of them are represented here today: the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, where I work, the International Republican Institute, where Owen is from, and there are 2 other core institutes. One is called the International Center for Labor Solidarity, which is affiliated to the AFL-CIO. It's often called the Solidarity Center for short. And there's the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is affiliated with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And we usually refer to it by its acronym as CIPE, C-I-P-E. And so under the rubric of the National Endowment for Democracy, the idea was to provide relatively modest core funding to institutes that represented the 4 sort of ideological tendencies within the U.S. as a whole. So business, labor, Democrats, Republicans. It's a bit of a broad way of putting it, but that was the idea. And in fact, the founding of the National Endowment and the founding of the institutes was in at least a small part a reaction to a perception that the U.S. was active in political life and politics in other countries, but not always in a way that was wanted or accepted. So in the 80s, when people were looking at either transitions or potential transitions, political transitions in places like the Philippines, Chile, and elsewhere, it was decided that the U.S. should have an open, overt, and constructive role in providing help, assistance, advice to other countries which were trying to achieve their own democracy. And that's how the institutes were formed. As the years have gone on, the core funding through the National Endowment for Democracy has basically been the same. It hasn't increased. It's actually fairly modest. In fact, the National Endowment's overall yearly budget was increased for the first time last year to something along the lines of $40 million. It had been around 28 or 30 million for most of its existence. And the party institutes, the other core institutes, get a relatively tiny percentage of that. So each organization has grown in a different way. The two institutes that we're representing are 501c3 charitable organizations in the sense that donations are tax deductible. They are NGOs. They are governed by private boards of directors. And they are very much operated as private, independent organizations. So each, even though it receives a core amount of funding from the National Endowment, has developed its own policies, its own culture, its own way of doing things. And in fact, each one has pursued and received grant funding from a number of different sources. And in fact, these days, the National Endowment contribution is probably a minority of the funding of both organizations. That's the history. What I thought we would do, as was mentioned, is go a little bit back and forth, and I think we wanted to talk first about the different approaches of each organization. Even though I think we work in a complementary way, we do tend to look at the world a little bit differently, and we tend to see different priorities when we look at countries that are in transition to democracy. But I did want to mention before we did that, just in a little bit of reaction to the previous speakers, there is much more being done on the ground around the world than most people know. And it's done even at a more detailed and I think more profound level than is known. We don't consider what we do at our institutes as public diplomacy, which was really the topic of the previous panel. And we don't consider it that in the sense that we are providing real life kind of practical advice from practitioners. In other words, when we have local partners within political parties or parliaments or civil society organizations in the Middle East, we're not doing that because we think that it's going to advance the cause of the U.S. or U.S. foreign policy particularly, and we don't do it because we think that it's going to have a positive perception or a positive impact on people's perception of the U.S. We do it because we believe, and we might talk about this a little bit, because we believe as organizations that it's our mission to help to promote the basic principles of democracy around the world. In other words, we believe that everyone in every country deserves as much freedom and as much choice and as much control over the decisions that affect their lives, that each person deserves that as much as the next. In other words, we don't think that there are countries or regions that are inherently less democratic. We don't believe that there are countries or regions that don't deserve some kind of help to become more open and free and to help their governments become more accountable. Now, in doing that, and of course there are many, many nuances within that broad framework that I talked about, in doing that, there are going to be positive effects. The notion that there are organizations that are providing valued assistance, advice, and help, and that these organizations are based in Washington and to some extent involve Americans, although we're both very international, that is going to have a positive effect. In fact, in Yemen where we work, and this may sound counterintuitive, we're called the National Democratic Institute, but everyone in Yemen likes to call us the American Democratic Institute because they want people to know that it's American. And we're well known there. In fact, we're in the paper almost every day. People appreciate the notion that there is an American organization providing political development, and so they think national is not descriptive enough. So this is not public diplomacy per se. We are practitioners actually carrying out programs on the ground which are very much designed with local partners, but it can have the effect of putting forward a positive face of U.S. foreign policy. I'll end there with the sort of broad overview and throw it over to Owen. And like I say, we have different ways of looking at things, sometimes different approaches, and we thought we'd have a bit of a dialogue. Sure.
Start on the topic of sort of the general approach. Our approaches have changed. IRI has changed. I'll have to admit that here to Les today. In the past, when we looked at the Middle East and we looked at countries and had to choose where to operate, we used to think very strategically at IRI. We'd look at countries and wonder and ask the question, is that country of strategic value? Well, that's no longer an issue anymore because we recognize with the situation in Afghanistan and elsewhere that we can't let a single country fall through the cracks. So it's of strategic interest that every country in the Middle East receive some attention in terms of democratic reform and the assistance that organizations like ours can provide. So that aside, we still have to ask, are there opportunities? Are there openings? Now, openings and opportunities are different than demand. In every country in which IRI and NDI work, and every country in the region, there is a demand. There's a demand for reform, for change. It's apparent. I mean, I know there's a lot of debate, particularly in the West and in academic circles, about Islam and democracy. Are the two compatible? This isn't really an issue on the street. The issue in the street in the Middle East is really between democracy and dictatorship. The fact that Islamist parties are growing or are seen with favor is actually evidence of the fact that the street wants change, that they want more transparent government. But because there's a demand, it doesn't mean necessarily that there's an opening for us. If you take a country like, let's say an example, let's use Morocco. Morocco's a good example. Morocco, tremendous openings in the country. It's actually a very unique situation in the region, in that you have multi-party politics. You recently had probably the most transparent, or arguably the most transparent, elections in the country's history. And yet, you have parties that are ossified. You have a leadership as well that has shown an inclination for change and that it favors reform. The problem is the leadership is constrained in its ability to maneuver. It is looking to the political parties and to civil society to pick up the slack, to carry the ball. But the ossified parties, the sort of infancy of the civil society movement in the country requires help. So there's a place where there is an opening, and given the resources, our organizations like our own can have tremendous impact. But if you look at a country like Egypt, for instance, tremendous demand, tremendous need, but very little opportunity for organizations like our own to have an impact. The political environment is so constrained that there's very little for us to work with. The party, it's a one-party state. They don't have really a history of multi-party elections. So there, our ability to really have an impact is limited.
Just as I've been listening to Owen talk, I realized that it might be more helpful to even go further than Owen in describing some of the very specific types of activities, because I know probably by now you're saying, well, what exactly is it that these organizations do? Just a couple of examples following on Owen's country examples. IRI is involved in Morocco very much, has been, so is NDI, but I'll talk about Yemen for a second. In Yemen, what do we do? NDI has had an office in Sana'a, Yemen, the capital, steadily since 1996. That office has been staffed with a combination of expats, often Americans, sometimes Canadians and others, and Yemenis. In fact, a number of the Yemenis that have been working at office have been there for many years and have sort of grown up through the organization and have been promoted and become very professional in this work. We have provided political party training in Yemen. By that I mean we bring in political party practitioners who conduct seminars, roundtables, one-on-one consultations with party leaders, and put forward information on how parties organize themselves, how they put together congresses, for example, how they organize election campaigns in other countries in the world. This is very international, though. We don't try to promote a U.S. model. We try to get examples from around the world that might be more relevant to the situation. NDI has often acted as an honest broker role. The government of Yemen, which has authoritarian tendencies, to put it mildly, often will try to repress the parties within its own multi-party system. It allows a multi-party system, but I think the president of Yemen wakes up almost every day and wonders why he allows a multi-party system, and so his instinct is to try to sort of push it down, and we often will go to the president or the prime minister or the head of the ruling party and say, look, you know, we think you should allow within the law, for example, the media law, or allow within certain other provisions of the country room for these parties, because if you genuinely want to become a democracy and to be perceived as such, these parties need to be freer. Just another quick example. In Jordan, very recently, NDI was involved, as well as IRI, in the lead up to the election. Jordan had decided to put aside 6 seats for women. We can talk about that later. That's actually quite a trend throughout the Middle East, is the setting aside of parliamentary seats for women. But when NDI was working with about 30 women that were thinking of running for these seats, and one of the things that we realized was that almost, other than their own resources, some of the women were wealthy, most were not. There was no system within the country for raising money for political purposes. So we realized that having 30 women running was not very useful if only 1 or 2 of them had personal wealth to allow them to run. And no one in the country was used to having, particularly a woman, come up and ask for money. That was sort of culturally not possible. So one of the things that NDI did was worked with 2 or 3 of the Jordanian women's organizations to I wouldn't say promote the idea, but to let them know of the idea of the political action committee model, like in the U.S. And in fact, the organizations caught on to that quickly, and they established a fund where they went to big businesses in Jordan, collected relatively decent donations, $5,000 to $10,000 at a time, and put together a small fund that women could apply to. So it was a bit like an Emily's List, or sort of a small fund for women. And that was done, ends up being rather an indigenous activity, because it's run by Jordan women's organizations, it's funded by Jordanians, but it was helped along by some advice from NDI. So those would be some practical examples of activities.
And also in Jordan, I mean, not that Les and I sat down and planned this out, but it just happened that our programs had sort of this symmetry where NDI was working with candidates. We were working with a local organization to provide venues for women to meet with the public. So we sort of divided up the north, south, and central of the country, and had these forums or workshops where candidates could come in and sit down and talk with youth and women in particular, too, that sort of marginalized segments in society.
Are there philosophically different reasons why the two of you might take different approaches, if you would, based on your origins or anything else?
Well, I don't know if there are philosophical differences. I mean, no, there are some differences in how the approach is implemented. One of the first things we do is, if we go into a country, is we try to identify local partners. We have a preference for working through local partners. We think that the local partnership gives the effort credibility and is sustainable. We've never had a problem in any country in the region in identifying groups on the ground that have a vision that we share, a vision for change, for pluralism, for rule of law. Sometimes these groups need to have their capacities developed, but they exist. Every country in the region, there are people with the same sort of aspirations that we have, and with a little assistance, they can be quite effective. I think they can be more effective than us out there, IRI, but That's just the way we see it.
Well, and there's an interesting difference here. Owen mentioned that IRI has been changing over the last couple of years, which is true, because I think if I had been asked the question about differences in ideology or philosophy a couple of years ago, I would have said that the big difference between NDI and IRI was that IRI tended to be a much more focused organization that had its eye much more on sort of U.S., United States, sort of broadly speaking, geostrategic priorities. And we used to joke actually at NDI that NDI, on the other hand, was this sort of freewheeling kind of non-hierarchical organization where we were developing programs all over the world in almost every country. I mean, to sort of draw the distinction, we often would sort of say, well, the difference between IRI and NDI looked a lot like the difference between the Democrats and Republicans in the U.S., in the sense that the Democratic Institute tended to be this sort of enthusiastic people, maybe not being very strategic, kind of trying to embrace everything and do everything at the same time, and maybe not always doing everything well, but I think we did things pretty well. Whereas IRI tended to be a much more focused organization that had its eye on U.S. strategic goals. That, as Owen has said, has changed. But I think counterintuitively, based on what you might think of the parties in country, NDI has been much less local partner driven in the Middle East, for example, than IRI. NDI, for example, has established relatively active offices in places like Morocco, Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq. Now we'll talk about Iraq in a minute. We have an office dealing with Palestinians in Jerusalem. We have an office in Bahrain and Yemen. And so NDI has sort of really established its presence. And while we sometimes work with local partners, our point of view has often been that if there was local expertise in things like parliamentary development and political party development, then we wouldn't be needed. So we think that we actually provide a lot of that expertise because it's sort of, by definition, not available in the region. And it's been interesting with this sort of, what I think is a slightly counterintuitive approach, IRI, and we can talk about this a little bit because I think it's always interesting. NDI has then tended to work with national level politicians in the national level parliament, whereas IRI has tended to have a much deeper engagement at the local level, at the local council level, and sometimes at the sort of local organization level. I don't know if you want to expand on that a bit.
No, I mean, I think the profile of each institute in a particular country reflects where we're working. As Les said, I mean, there isn't political party knowledge per se in a country, so NDI has to be there, or IRI would have to be there providing that. But if we're working at the local level, we're not working with parties, and we're working to develop primarily some critical mass to pressure the parties to reform, to pressure the state to reform. That's not going to be, that objective won't be served by us pushing the agenda. It only can be pushed from within.
Just, I mean, I agree with that, and with the indulgence of the moderator, and who can obviously jump in listening again to the previous speakers, it made me think that I should offer something, and Owen may or may not entirely agree with this, but I should also mention that when we approach democracy development in the Middle East, we at NDI anyway, and I think Owen will agree, we'll find out in a second, do it with a strategy in mind. And I mention this because you can't turn on a television program these days, particularly the sort of cable news programs, without someone debating their notion of either the applicability or the possibility of democracy sort of sprouting in the Middle East. I mean, it's an endless debate. Owen mentioned the sort of Islam versus democracy debate, which I think we both agree is bogus and really is a waste of breath. Because I think we both agree that there's absolutely nothing incompatible about Islam and democracy. But I think I would go even further to say that the struggle in the Middle East, in almost every country, is about what I would term as the potential moderate or democratic middle. In my experience in the Arab world, and that's mostly where I work, although a little bit in Afghanistan, my experience in the Arab world is that there is I'll go backwards a little bit. I think that there's a little bit of chauvinism or something in the notion that that people in the Arab world, the Arab Middle East, are very much different from us. And so when I hear people developing and expressing these very sort of complicated strategies about how they're going to, let's not attack, but let's kind of get at the Islamic religious leaders and sort of convince them that their reading of Islam is wrong, and let's go at the on the other side, let's go at the the authoritarians, and there's this, you often hear the argument there's an Arab affinity for sort of strong men, and we have to understand that, and that's part of the mentality. In fact, you heard a lot of that talk around the strategy in Iraq. I always hate that kind of conversation, because I think even though there may be some truth to both sides, that you have to deal with both the Islamic religious leadership and you have to deal with authoritarian leaders, I agree with that to some extent. But what seems to be completely ignored, and like I say, there's something somewhat chauvinistic about it, is that why don't we imagine, as we would imagine here in the U.S., that the vast majority of people neither agree with the Islamic extremists nor with the authoritarians. The vast majority of people want to live a prosperous, free life with their families, to enjoy the fruits of their labor, to live in an atmosphere free of repression, to have a media that's free to report the truth. Why don't we just assume that is what the vast majority of people want? And if the support that we provide, and by support I mean all of the types of programs and activities that you've talked about this morning, including NDI and IRI's activities, which are aimed at sort of the political class and civil society, if the support that we provide is aimed at building and supporting that potential moderate democratic middle, in my opinion, the two extremes then eventually wither. In other words, the authoritarian extreme on the one hand, the religious extreme on the other hand, won't have the adherence anymore if the transformation in these societies is made. Now, I realize that can be that can sound very naive, because that's not about to happen tomorrow. But I think it's important as a construct, sort of as a way of looking at it, that we perceive outreach from the U.S. as aimed at this potentially large democratic middle. And so we tend to, in our programs, whether it's working with Islamic parties, which we do, it's working with the moderates and the modernists within those Islamic parties. Whether it's working within government structures, which we do, it's working with reform-minded elements within those structures. And then, as Owen mentioned, in the middle, it's working with civil society organizations and others that can bring to bear some pressure on these sort of ossified forces to kind of break them up.
Before we move to questions from the fellows, let me ask each of you, starting with Owen, to use all that background to address specifically your view of the prospects, compare and contrast the prospects in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've had very topical discussions here the last 2 days, and I think those two situations would be of particular interest.
Start with Afghanistan. I first went to Afghanistan January 2002, and after a few days in Kabul, came out shaking my head. The situation, however, has improved. It took actually a visit to Pakistan and to see sort of Afghan life, sort of microcosm in the border regions, to recognize that the capacities there, the professionals, the academics, the ingredients for a revival of Afghanistan exist. They just need to ship back into the country, and that process has been occurring. Fortunately, we're giving a little more attention to Afghanistan these days as well. We're increasing our support for reconstruction, and we're putting a little more effort or focus on the political reconstruction process. Unfortunately, we haven't put, to date, sufficient focus on the political reconstruction process in Afghanistan, but the situation is improving. Afghanistan is doable. The answers aren't as complicated as many might think. They're actually much simpler than in Iraq. For fear, run the risk that I may be misperceived here or misunderstood. The environment is much different in Afghanistan. We're talking about highly illiterate, impoverished community once you get outside the urban centers. It's a country, this is a society, or these are communities that have existed under tribal and traditional sort of leadership and networks and customs for a long time. If the democratic vision can be embraced and sold to this level of leadership in the communities, the situation will be resolved, I believe. If we can bring along what has been sort of the marginalized political elite in the countryside, marginalized during the last 25 years of conflict in the country, if we can reach out to them and have them embrace sort of pluralistic democratic process, they will carry the street with them. Very simple sort of approach, a little more complicated on implementation, but if we give the focus to these local communities, to these tribal and traditional structures, I think we can undermine the regressive elements in the countryside. But the process today is hampered by infrastructure. Security situation is one thing, but the security situation in Afghanistan is exacerbated by the fact that the central government has very little ties to the communities. Roads are down. There's no telephone networks. Radio, television broadcasting is very weak. So if the central government can can be felt in the countryside and the marginalized leadership brought back into the political process, then we can move things in the right direction. Iraq is a much tougher situation. You have what was once a massive middle class, one of the probably largest middle classes in the Middle East, large civil service. These people enjoyed great prosperity during the oil years, the boom years. They have expectations and aspirations that they want addressed. They want their prosperity restored. This is going to take a tremendous undertaking. But what we need to do now is we need to provide mechanisms that will bring the largest number of people into the political process in Iraq. Today, we have the governing council. It's not sufficient. We need to engage more and more folks in the process. We have to create stakeholders. And once we create stakeholders, we can undermine the regressive elements that are trying to keep the country back.
Well, I'll talk briefly in Iraq. All of the things that I've mentioned in terms of strategy and approach for democratization, or let me put that differently, none of the things that I've talked about in terms of a strategy or approach for democratization are currently happening in Iraq, which is surprising since I think that I would argue, and it's not just I think many would argue, that the main problem or main issue in Iraq is political and political development and societal development in the sense of, as Owen said, engaging people in the decisions that are going to govern and influence their lives. And those two things, political development and a genuine engagement of Iraqis into the decisions that are going to affect their lives, are conspicuously and have been conspicuously missing from the rebuilding strategy. And there, other than, and I should, to be fair, there have been a number of local councils developed. There's been a sort of a sense that political development in Iraq would start at the local level and build up. And that's good, and I think that that the people that have done that deserve credit for that. That's been a part of U.S. assistance there. That has been a little bit problematic, though, because Iraqis have no experience of local government. One day they'll realize that local government is probably the best level for them because local government can perhaps solve some of the basic neighborhood problems. But local government, in the absence of a credible national Iraqi government, has not been helpful because to whom do these councils go for decisions? Where do they get the resources? That's been a real problem. And yet at the national level, the level of the development of political forces, political parties, the level of development of national organizations that could take on an advocacy role, the level of the governing council, as Owen mentioned, the sort of decision makers at the national level, there has been little or no attention paid to that development. And this is despite, and I spent about 6 weeks in Iraq over the summer, this is despite what we've described at NDI as an explosion of politics. One of the many things you don't see on the news about Iraq is that there are well over 100 brand new political parties. In fact, there were 100 in July. There are probably more like 200. People very much spontaneously got together and said, well, we have to protect our interests and we want to put forward a point of view. We have an idea. Let's form a group. They don't always call them parties because party has a bad name because of the Ba'ath Party, but they're basically parties. There are dozens and dozens, if not maybe even in the hundreds, of civil society organizations. There are, believe it or not, there are environmentalists in Baghdad, I've met them, who say, this place is a mess, we have to get on top of this, and they want to advocate for environmental policies. There are people who are interested in labor issues, for example, because privatization is kind of in the offing, and there are people who say, well, what happens to the workers from these state enterprises? Even if we don't want the state enterprises, the workers need rights, so we need labor legislation. All of this is happening in Iraq, and in my opinion, this should be one of the main issues of assistance for the coalition provisional authority, and yet it has not up until now been, because I think arguably in places like Afghanistan, certainly in Iraq and other places, this political development, civil society development, in the end is almost more important. Maybe it is more important than infrastructure development. And to sort of close on this, because it might interest people. The kind of money that we're talking about is minuscule. Effective programs of assistance to political parties, civil society organizations, to something like the Governing Council in Iraq, to parliaments, can be done for figures along the lines of $1 million, $2 million, $5 million would be an awful lot. And so in a place like Iraq, out of the supplemental request for $87 billion, of which about $20 billion is going for infrastructure development, so on, 5, 10, 15, 20 million of that for political and civil society development would go a huge way toward helping what I think is probably the most important sector of rebuilding.
Okay, grim and challenging in both countries. We'll go to questions from the fellows now. The usual rules of identify yourself and your school. Could we have a microphone by Amanda up here? I know she was waiting early on. We don't have much time, so try to keep it brief, please.
Good morning. Amanda Post, University of Chicago. Thanks so much for your insights. My question is for both gentlemen. Both of you have made a generic reference to civil society building projects. I was wondering if you could flesh out some of the specific projects you're doing and how that is encouraging or perhaps retarding the political party growth.
Les, I think, put a figure on, I don't know if he actually put a percentage on the number of individuals in the region or in a given country that are in the middle, that don't tend towards either of the two dominant political trends, either the state and dictatorial tendencies or the Islamist tendencies. Did you give a figure? Kind of 40%, 30-something percent, for instance. This is not wishful thinking. We track these issues. We know them. One of our projects in the West Bank and Gaza has been polling. We conduct through local university public opinion polls. We've been doing this for about 10 years on a quarterly basis. We're able to track this group in the middle that exists. We know that in the West Bank, Gaza, for instance, there is this block, about 40%, that historically, I mean, consistently over the last decade or so, have not shown support for any of the existing political party structures. Our polls, though, provide a voice as well. They provide a voice for this 40% and the rest to communicate with their leadership, to continue voicing what their needs are, what their priorities are. The poll, in conjunction with the poll, we have a radio show that we support in which experts and political figures are invited to come in and to discuss the findings. And the polls put pressure on the establishment. The polling and all the work that NDI and IRI has conducted in the West Bank and Gaza has kept some of the real autocratic tendencies of the Palestinian Authority in check. We may think that this is a very authoritarian, corrupt regime. It could be far worse.
Another question? Down here, Amy, please, Jeremy.
Good morning, First Class Jerry Greenwood from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. My question to you would be, I agree that democracy and Islam can inherently go together and can work, but obviously there are regimes throughout the Islamic community that would be very hostile to American or Western democratic theory and practice. Have you experienced, as an American NGO, have you experienced resistance, and if so, what do you do to overcome that?
Maybe I'll jump in on that one. Just briefly on an answer to the previous question as well, just another practical example. In Yemen, there were elections this past April, and NDI worked with the coalition of civil society groups to help them field more than 15,000 local monitors. We helped provide some of the basis of the training, although the training was done by the organizations. We funded them, although in the end they fundraised most of the money themselves, and then we gave them advice on how to deploy that many monitors and come back. And we saw that as helping political parties, because the election monitoring is more credible when it comes from a local source than an international source. So just another example. We do run into some resistance, but not nearly as much as one would imagine. In fact, as Owen said, post-September 11th, the demand for assistance in democracy and political reform has exploded for NDI and IRI. We cannot get the funding and the staff fast enough, both organizations, to fill the jobs and to fill the demand, which, by the way, reminds me to look on our websites for jobs, because there are jobs there in both organizations. And so that is counterintuitive. We run into problems, but I would argue, and I hope I don't sound sort of that I'm simplifying it too much, vested interests in the countries often give us problems. Just as an example, we were working in Kuwait with women who are trying to put together a strategy to get the vote for women. We do get criticized by some of the more Islamic-oriented parties in Kuwait for that. In fact, we kind of get slammed in the press. It's perceived as interference, and they say, well, you know, these Americans are importing foreign ideas. But I would argue, I don't worry too much about that. I would argue, if one part of the society is asking for, we didn't offer this, we were approached many, many times, one part of society is asking for this help, and the other one is criticizing it as interference and kind of imposing Western ideals, why would we believe that one side is more right than the other? In other words, it probably is both at the same time. We should respond to the request. We should also be sensitive about the calls about interference. But it more reflects a schism within that society, that I think, than it does Islam. In other words, they're just disagreeing with each other, and we're in the middle.
Time for one more, Chris.
Thank you very much. Chris Conwell, North Georgia College and State University, the Georgia that is close to Chattanooga. My question, first of all, I want to commend you. You guys are on the front lines, obviously, of probably, arguably, the most difficult thing that we stand up against right now. When our administration makes decisive actions, similar, like Secretary Rumsfeld made the comment that democracy is going to happen in Iraq, but it won't be a cleric. There was the Predator drone strike, I guess it was in Yemen, which is sort of absolutely counter democracy. How is it that you guys are going to apply enough back pressure when you have such decisiveness coming from the top? How are you going to be just as decisive? And hopefully there isn't a whole lot of redundancy in the question I'm asking you, but how do you, both of you, hope to be as decisive? Thank you.
Owen, you want to start?
Less. Let's see how you.
Well, this Owen's throwing over to me because this is one of the questions I think both of us face all the time in that form or different forms, and maybe because I'm a Canadian, I can I feel free to be slightly more critical sometimes of things that I perceive as a bit of an outsider. This is a problem, and in the Arab world, one of the things that I never downplay is this notion of a perception of hypocrisy. Yemen's a good example, and I really want to be careful not to criticize, because the U.S. government, the ambassador there, has been incredibly supportive of pushing democracy in Yemen. But at the same time, the U.S. government has a real problem in Yemen of it harboring terrorists, accidentally or on purpose, we're not sure, probably accidentally. And so it is difficult, and I don't want to criticize the notion that someone felt it important, necessary to assassinate someone in Yemen. But on the other hand, the U.S. also feels it important and necessary to support political party development and a free media. And the way that I often will describe this to a foreign audience after I explain that I'm a bit of an outsider in this and I can't quite explain the U.S. policy process, I will then say the best way of looking at it is don't try to figure this all out, how the U.S. can say one thing and sometimes say a different thing. Just accept the best and worst of both. The U.S. is supporting democracy in the Middle East. It does it very strongly often, and often with good diplomatic backing. But the U.S. also does things very decisively and very openly that are perceived as hypocritical in the region and make it sometimes difficult for us to work. And I think as organizations, we just try to absorb that, and we try to put forward what we believe to be the positive face of the notion of sending out the best of the U.S. experience, the best of U.S. values, and sharing the U.S. experience in democracy, which is crucial.
Okay, I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions. I'm sure both gentlemen would be glad to chat with you after the program is over if you have specific questions for them. We have a few wrap-up comments from Dr. David Abshire now.
Paul, first of all, I want to thank you and the panelists very much for this I think as they emphasize, there's an enormous amount of stuff that's going on the ground. I want to end with a note of optimism. Leadership's supposed to deal with optimism. If you've got the right attitude, you can move mountains. Now, there's bad news about the anti-Americanism in the polls, Zogby polls, Pew polls. There's some good news that we failed to mention in the polling, that throughout the Arab and Muslim world, they bought into globalization. We got people before the IMF in these meetings that are out parading against globalization. You don't find that in the polls of the people that want jobs, they want investment, they want better education, they want to be in the system. And it's interesting that some of the things that we tend to identify as American values, they identify as universal values, and they want to be in the system. Second, the UNDP has done a series of UN development programs, have done a series of reports, including the role of women and what it's going to mean to get the role of women into the workforce for the economies of these countries. So increasingly within the area, we see reforms that are taking place, and it's our job not to Americanize those reforms, but to help those reforms go forward. Lastly, I spoke of the taking of my belief that the administration and the Congress is going to take action on the report that the Congress mandated, that Ambassador Derigian chaired, that I had the privilege of being on following our report. The Appropriations Committee held up the appropriations to the State Department until there was a report on the action that the administration was going to take on our recommendations. So I believe that we're going to see within the executive branch and the legislative branch in the next few months decisive action. So I don't want you to leave here with the feeling that things are not going to happen, because a lot of us are working to see that they're going to happen. So with that, I'll call on our Dean for administrative comments. And once again, I thank you, gentlemen, very much, and to you, Paul.
Why don't we all join in thanking David Abshire, Rob Henderson, and the whole Center for the Study of the Presidency for a great 3 days.
Thank you very much. What we're going to do is take a brief refreshment break. We'll have some few last wrap-up words from Dr. Abshire. Then we've invited Owen Kirby, Les Campbell, and Asma Hasan to join us for box lunches here afterwards. So, in any case, I want to thank you all again for your participation, for your timeliness today, and for your good fresh look this morning. Okay, thank you.
You can see live coverage of war-related issues on Monday here on C-SPAN. At 12:30, Senator Dianne Feinstein at the Council on Foreign Relations. Then at 1:30 Eastern, a hearing on Iraqi reconstruction contracts hosted by the Democratic Policy Committee. At 6:30, Road to the White House with Vice President Dick Cheney and Democratic presidential candidates John Kerry and General Wesley Clark.